The story begins in a remote mountain village called Sotoba. The village men are searching for Shimizu Megumi, a young resident. They frantically look for her all around. Right then, we see her body on the ground in an unresponsive state. Several days earlier, Megumi, wearing a pink Western-style dress with a parasol, is strolling around. She is approached by some elders who try to talk to her, but she is visibly irritated by them. She runs away from them, proclaiming she hates the village. Megumi wishes to graduate from high school and go to an urban university. The only thing she likes in the village is a mysterious yet beautiful mansion that was recently built, and Natsuno Yuki, a boy who recently moved from the big city. A couple of days later, the bodies of an old couple are discovered, rotting and infested with maggots. Just outside, a young priest named Seishin Moroi, who discovered the bodies, is being interrogated by the police. He then goes to the village clinic to meet the doctor Ozaki Tashio, who is also his childhood friend. 2 days later, we see Megumi, dressed up for school, hesitantly mailing a letter when she's interrupted by Tanaka Kori, who wants to walk together with her to school. Annoyed, Megumi runs off where she sees Natsuno. She tries to get his attention, but is ignored. Next day at midnight, a suspicious-looking blue-haired guy suddenly starts honking at the house of a resident. He introduces himself as a member of Kirishiki family, who are moving into the mansion, and asks for directions. Megumi, daydreaming about living in the mansion, is interrupted yet again by Kori. She runs uphill after getting annoyed with her when she reaches the castle, from which she gets an unpleasant feeling that someone is watching her. Later that night, Kori's mother asks if she saw Megumi, because she still had not reached home. They figure out she went up the mountain, and the villagers gather to search for her. Next night, she is found alive. Ozaki comes to check on her. The next day, a beautiful blonde lady called Kirishiki Chizuru, the lady of the mansion, is introduced. Kori goes to check up on Megumi, whose health seems to be worsened and dies the next day. Cause of death is claimed to be heart failure. On Megumi's deathbed, Ozaki apologizes to her family, who are heartbroken. The following day, Natsuno leaves home just as her mother reminds him that Megumi's funeral is scheduled in the afternoon. He is standing in the middle of the road as he is tackled by the dog of the clinic's nurse, Kunihiro Ritsuko. They head to the funeral together. Kori visits Megumi's room, where she finds the postcard she previously tried to send, which is addressed to Natsuno. She tries to hand him the letter at the funeral, but he refuses to accept it. The next day, Megumi's blood tests are delivered to Ozaki. He finds out he misdiagnosed Megumi and is unsure of her cause of death. Suddenly, Hashiguchi Yasuo, another nurse at the clinic, informs Ozaki that there has been another death. In the following days, Ozaki is informed that yet another old woman has passed away. Upon hearing about her symptoms, he figures that all the recent deaths had similar symptoms. He calls the town's health official, Ishida, to find out the number of people that had died this summer. At night, Natsuno is studying in his room when he hears a noise outside. Next day, Seishin confronts Ozaki about the cause of death of all the people that had died. A few days go by and heavy rainfall ensues. Ishida visits Ozaki and Seishin. He reveals that there have been 10 deaths in August alone. They suspect that there is an epidemic going around. Natsuno, in his bedroom, gets an unsettling feeling that someone is watching him from behind his closed window. Next day, he is walking to school when Murutoru, his only friend in the village, and Ritsuko pass by him in a car and offer him a ride. Natsuno looks drowsy as he explains he hasn't slept well because of the unsettling feeling he got yesterday night. On their way, they pass by Tamatsu, Toru's younger brother, and his friend Murasaka Masao. Toru and Natsuno drop Ritsuko at the clinic, where Ozaki is examining a patient named Nao, and sees that she also has similar symptoms to Megumi. He asks Ritsuko to call the patient so he can re-examine her. Meso gets back home, where his brother's child Hiromi and wife Shizuko invite him to eat out, but he refuses. Masao's displeasure towards both of them is evident. Nao's husband Yasumori, an old friend of Ozaki and Seishin, brings her to the clinic where her health has deteriorated. After ordering for all sorts of tests, Ozaki asks Yasumori questions about the health of his family. He mentions that he met the couple living in the mansion, Chizuru and Seishiro. Later that night, Seishin encounters a mysterious little girl named Sunako, who tells him that she is a fan of his novels. A few days later, Nao has passed away. Later that night, Toru goes out to buy some juice where he encounters Tatsumi, the blue-haired guy. He helps Toru, so he invites him to hang out at his house sometime. Tatsumi agrees with a villainous tone. Seishin receives news that 2 more people have died. Meanwhile, Natsuno is restlessly staring outside his room. He has a strong presence, similar to that of Megumi, yet much more sinister. A couple of days later, Susumu, the son of Nao, is also in a near-death state. Ozaki tries his best, but fails to keep him alive. Yasumori himself is in a similar condition. Ozaki asks the medical staff to take Yasumori along with them to the hospital. Same night, Natsuno is still feeling the sinister presence outside, to such an extent that he abruptly wakes up in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, Seishin is going towards a church in a remote location, where he again meets Sunako. Next day, Ozaki gets a call from the hospital that Yasumori has passed away. He immediately calls a staff meeting in which he tells everyone that an unknown epidemic is going around. Meanwhile, Natsuno, riding the bus back home, starts to hallucinate and starts seeing images of Megumi. After he gets off the bus, he meets Toru, who he asks if he can stay over, and Toru accepts. Later at midnight, Tatsumi and Megumi are standing outside Toru's house, with bloodshot eyes. They sneakily enter the house. Natsuno feels the heavy presence of Megumi again. Suddenly the door opens, but it turns out to be Toru's little sister. Just as Natsuno sighs a breath of relief, Megumi, in a contorted form with lifeless eyes, gets out from under Toru's bed. She goes to bite Toru's neck as Natsuno just lays there unable to move. Natsuno jolts out of bed, panting heavily. He jumps up and searches Toru's neck for bite marks. When he doesn't find them, he convinces himself that it was nothing but a dream. As some time passes, Natsuno realizes he can no longer feel Megumi's presence around. One morning he goes to visit Toru. On the way he sees Ozaki rush to his destination. Worried, he himself also rushes into his room, where Ozaki is examining him and proclaims Toru's death. Natsuno goes to Toru's wake, feeling crushed by the loss of his only friend, where he finds Meso present. After the wake, Meso tries to pick a fight with Natsuno, but is scolded by his family and runs away. On his way home, Meso spots a white ghostly figure, and while pursuing it, the white figure sneaks behind him and bites Meso's neck. Meanwhile, Natsuno's mother delivers him a postcard, the same one that Megumi had written before her death. He tears up the postcard and throws it out. Megumi is lurking behind the vegetation. As this happens, she starts to cry with her lifeless eyes. Next day, Meso is laying on his bed, extremely sick and pale as a ghost, and just beneath him is the mourning for the death of Hiromi. Soon after, Ozaki is at his clinic, where yet another patient has been admitted. Ozaki notices the bite marks and thinks they are from an insect, thinking the epidemic might be caused via an animal carrier. Later that night, Sumeko visits Seishin at the desolate church once again, where they converse for a bit. Next day, Meso's corpse is still in bed, as files freely roam inside his mouth. Meanwhile, Natsuno visits Toru's house and watches horror DVDs with Tomosu, so he can learn more about these creatures. Tomatsu then tells Natsuno about a legend in the village about the undead. A couple of days later, the villagers are talking about yet another death when they are interrupted by Ito Ikumi, claiming that it will continue, and these deaths have started right after the mansion was built, but the villagers don't buy it. Meanwhile, Ozaki is trying to find a cure to this epidemic by experimenting on the patients. As some time passes, Natsuno visits Ozaki. Kori and her younger brother Akira are also suspicious of the castle, because Akira saw Yasumori supposedly dead enter the castle, so they plan to stake out. Meanwhile, they were being watched by Tatsumi, who lurked in the shadows. Natsuno tells Kori and Akira that they were being watched. They all want to confirm their suspicions, so they decide to dig up Megumi's grave. Meanwhile, Meso is laying in some flowers when he realizes that this is his coffin. He claws the grave in an attempt to get out, until Tatsumi digs him out of the grave. Tatsumi explains that Meso is no longer a human, and convinces him to live as an undead while surviving on human blood. The next day, Kori and Akira go to meet Natsuno for their plan. They start heading towards the grave, led by Kori, when her mind starts rushing with thoughts and emotions. Meanwhile, Ozaki explains his findings to Seishin, who is flabbergasted. Ozaki admits a sickly woman so that he can find conclusive evidence about the undead's existence. They start to dig up the grave throughout the evening. By the time they reach her coffin, the night has arrived. Natsuno opens up the coffin, only to prove their suspicions. Megumi's corpse is nowhere to seen. Suddenly, Kori is dragged away by an undead. Natsuno, in order to save her, bashes the creature's head in. The undead goes limp, and they decided to bury the undead back into Megumi's grave. Next day, when they returned, the undead had already escaped. They decided to dig up the grave of another person who had recently died, so they could figure out ways to fight these creatures, but decided to postpone it as nightfall was close. At Natsuno's house, a suspicious little ventriloquist girl is invited into their home by Natsuno's mother. For a few days, both Ozaki and Seishin stay in the clinic throughout the nights so they can prove their theory. Even though the creature doesn't appear for a few days, the health of the patient in the clinic starts to improve. Ozaki's wife Kyuko is called by her mother-in-law, as Ozaki is clearly exhausted from his recent routine. Ritsuko also prepares sandwiches for Ozaki and Seishin. On the way to deliver them, she spots Nao, who is supposed to be dead, also heading toward the hospital. Eventually, Nao reaches the hospital and both the doctor and young priest clearly see her. Ozaki refuses to invite Nao into the clinic and she quietly leaves. The next morning, the patient's condition improves significantly. As Ozaki rests in his office, his wife encounters Tatsumi, who she invites into the clinic for a drink. Later that night, there is a sudden blackout in the clinic. Seishin goes to turn on the generator and is confronted by Megumi and multiple other undead just outside the clinic. Meanwhile, Tatsumi attacks Ozaki from behind and retrieves the patient from the clinic. Tatsumi then gives the patient to Nao, Megumi, and the other undead to feed on, which leads to her death. Flashback to the day when the little ventriloquist girl entered the Yuki residence. When Natsuno comes home, he sees that the girl had already left. He realized that she was an undead, and in order to protect himself, he places numerous charms and rosaries across his room. He also warns Kori and Akira to not allow anyone to enter their house. A few days later, Tatsumi explains to everyone about the situation, about both Ozaki and Natsuno. Tatsumi declares that Natsuno needs to be killed. On the same day as the hospital incident, Natsuno encounters Toru outside his window, who tries to drag him outside. When he fails to do so, Toru runs away and is later found by Megumi while he is crying. Toru is conflicted because of the decision he had to make, to either kill his friend or rather let his family get attacked by other vampires. Megumi tries to convince Toru that she should be the one who kills Natsuno as she runs past him. Following the incident with Toru, Natsuno, disregarding basic common sense, goes out to search for him where he is confronted by Tatsumi. He tells him that Natsuno needs to die and calls out Megumi, who was hiding behind some trees. He allows Megumi to be the one who kills Natsuno. Just as they start to gang up on him, Toru sneaks up from behind and bites Natsuno on the neck. Natsuno falls down with a blank stare in his face. Itsumi, wearing spiritual grabs, tries to convince the other villagers about the mansion and its inhabitants. Although her suspicions are right, she uses this whole disaster in the village to earn money by selling scared villagers charms to protect them. Ozaki, armed with proof of the undead and their existence, resolves himself to capture one and show it to the villagers. He starts to dig up the grave of woman who was buried that day. Seishin appears out of the woods. They both have a small argument. Seishin is a bit reluctant in his heart, and Ozaki notices this, calling him a coward. Seishin runs off. Later that night, Seishin is sitting waiting for Sonako in the abandoned church. She appears and both chat for a while. Seishin tells Sonako that he believes that she is an undead. Sonako, who was just about to drink his blood upon hearing this statement, left without any harm. The next day, Ikumi starts to gather the villagers, who also start to believe his claims after all the recent deaths. He confronts Ozaki about the recent deaths, claiming that this was the work of the undead. Ozaki disagrees with her opinion, and Ikumi then leads the mob of villagers to the Kurashiki family's mansion. As they reach the mansion, Ikumi loudly bangs their door and demands them to come out. In response, Chizuru, the man of the castle, while wearing an elegant suit, comes out along with Tatsumi. Ikumi, amazed at how they can come out in daytime, still isn't satisfied. She puts a charm on him, but to no avail. Ozaki then confirms that Seishiro is indeed alive by checking his pulse, respiration, and body heat level. The doors of the mansion then close as all the villagers leave, but Ikumi is still unconvinced. Suddenly, a woman comes at Ikumi's house, crying and claiming that she needs her help because her family was being attacked by the undead. To prove her claims, Ikumi rushes out. Just as she runs out, the face of the woman who was asking for help is shown. She has an evil smirk, indicating that what she set out to accomplish was done. The end for now. The head of the undead, Tatsumi, wanted to kill Natsuno because he knew of their existence. He decided it would be Toru who kills him. Toru, also a vampire, reluctantly agreed. He bit Natsuno's neck from behind when he was not paying attention, making him fall face first on the ground. The next day, Natsuno calls out Kori and Akira at sunset. He reveals that he has been bitten and tells them to stay away from him because the next time they meet, he might not be himself. As a few days pass, Natsuno still hasn't been visited again by Toru, enabling his health to get better. He decides to keep a watch on the window from outside when Toru appears. He goes to knock on Natsuno's window but is hesitant, so Natsuno creeps up behind him, pulling out a cross. This scares Toru and he steps back. They converse for a bit when Natsuno gets upset at the fact that Toru is still himself, not an evil being. He angrily throws the cross, but immediately realizes his mistake and tries to run away. Toru follows him, but after running for a bit, Natsuno pulls out a stake and a hammer. But again, being unable to attack Toru, Natsuno tries to reason with him, offering him his blood. Toru tells him that it is impossible for the undead to coexist with humans, stating that the hunger for blood is unbearable. He hesitates for a bit, but ultimately pounces on Natsuno and drinks his blood. Meanwhile, Megumi is approached by Tatsumi, who asks her to attack Toru's dad, to which she promptly agrees. Natsuno's father, upon seeing his health, starts to think that it might be the epidemic that Ozaki mentioned. He tells his wife of this, who herself looks in a similar condition to all the victims of the undead before they died. She tells him it is nothing but a rumor. Unconvinced, he goes to the clinic just in case, but on the way, he comes across Kurashiki Chizuru, who yet again tells him that these are superstitions. Natsuno's father believes him and heads home. On his doorstep, he encounters Kaori and Akira, who have come to visit Natsuno. They bring charms and place them in his room. His dad, upon seeing this, becomes very angry and throws them away. And when they come to visit the next day, he doesn't allow it. They ask him to let them stay the night, to which his father says that he will alone keep a watch tonight. At night, Megumi attacks Kaori's father. Earlier the same day, Seishin is at his temple. Thinking about all the volunteers who help the temple function, he condemns himself to still be sympathetic to the undead. Meanwhile, another patient comes to the clinic. Upon examination, Ozaki tries to admit him, but the patient promptly refuses. Suddenly, Ozaki's mother informs him that Kyuko has also suddenly collapsed. He again sees that this is the undead's doing. At night, Natsuno tells Toru to come inside. He still hopes that Toru will have a change of heart and run away together with him. Toru apologizes, but goes to bite him in the neck with tears in his eyes, ending him. Next morning, Natsuno's father finds a note from his wife, which says that Natsuno is dead and she is leaving them both. His father looks for his wife, but isn't able to find her. He goes to check up on Natsuno, who is now but a lifeless corpse. Meanwhile, Kyuko passes away too. Ozaki lays some ice next to her and intently stares at her, in hopes she will revive, which she does not. Atsushi, the son of a liquor store owner, is approached by Shiki Chizuru, wearing extremely revealing clothes. He, upon seeing her, is bewitched by her beauty and invites her into his room. The next day, the staff is notified about another young nurse's disappearance, to which Ozaki is unresponsive. They receive a call informing the clinic that the patient who refused to be admitted has passed away. Later that night, Megumi tells Kaori, in a joyful yet sinister tone, that her father is dead. Kaori wakes Akira up, and they both discover their father dead on the floor. Their mother calls the Ibuki clinic. They tell her they will send somebody over, and before the call is over, a person comes to their door claiming he is from the clinic. The next day, Ozaki, who has kept the corpse of his wife in the clinic, decides to give up and finally bury her. But the same night, just for a second, he notices her brainwave activity returned. The next night, Megumi is informed that Natsuno was probably cremated and that she was promoted into the city corps, which kidnapped people from the city for low-ranking and newly risen vampires. Meanwhile, Ozaki starts to record her wife as signs of her revival become more stable. Just as Kyuko completely wakes up, he continues to experiment on her. Through his acts, Ozaki learns about killing them via a stake through the heart. That is when Seishin arrives. As Seishin sees Kyuko's body with a stake inside her in Ozaki, covered in blood, he immediately leaves. Next morning, Ozaki calls a few villagers, claiming he can prove that all the recent deaths were the doing of the undead. He suggests opening Neo's grave. The others refuse to listen to him. Defeated, Ozaki goes to the town hall, but there is no one present. He decides to visit at night, by which time all the employees are present. He asks a worker about the number of deaths in the summer, which the worker tells him is 0. Upon hearing this, he immediately understands that all the workers are vampires too. He proclaims he has been signing everyone's death certificate and tells them he has copies. That is when he is confronted by Chizuru, in an erotic dress, who tells Ozaki that he is her prey. She also orders the others to steal copies of the certificates before sending him out. Later the same night, a funeral for Atsushi is set up by the new funeral run by the Kirishiki family. We learn that the funeral home is nothing but a ruse and is used to recover dead. Meanwhile, Kyuko's wake is in process. The next night, Ozaki is sitting outside, smoking, when he is suddenly visited by Natsuno. Elsewhere, Toru is summoned by Sanako. She tells him about her past, hoping that he could be able to relate. Next day at night, Megumi meets Yoshikazu, the father of Kaori and Akira. He blames her for what she created him into. She also informs him that after tomorrow, he has to find his own food. She suggests him to attack his family in an attempt to make them rise as well. The next night, he goes to his home. Suddenly, their dog Love starts barking in Sachiko. Kaori's mother comes to check what's wrong. Faced by her dead husband, she gets scared and tries to run away, but Yoshikazu manages to grab her leg when it is temporarily outside the house's boundaries. He then attacks her while Megumi watches from afar, with a smirk on her face. Early in the morning, Kaori notices that her mother's health was similar to Natsuno before his death. Both Akira and Kaori decide to stay home from school and protect their mom. Akira goes to get more charms. On his way there, he hears about another family who moved out after seeing someone who resembled a dead person. He rushes home, gets a stake from Kaori, and goes to the family's house. He breaks into the house after finding it was boarded up. He finds an undead sleeping in the house. Just as is about to kill the undead, Tatsumi interrupts. He ties Akira up and leaves him. As night comes, the undead wakes up as Akira is rendered unable to move. Meanwhile, Natsuno tells Ozaki that they need to kill every vampire, including himself. Seishin meets Toru, who tells him everything. But even after all this, Toru remains unaffected. He leaves after stating his feelings. The next day, Seishin finds out that his father, the head priest, had written a letter to the Shiki family. He meets Kyori. She, who is dirty and scared to death, asks Seishin for a posthumous name, stating that all her family had died and she is next. Seishin tries to comfort her. He decides to walk into the den of the undead, the Shiki family mansion. At night, Ritsuko gets a call from a nurse at the hospital, Kiyomi, asking for help. She informs Ozaki and runs out, as he also follows after grabbing a steak. Ritsuko, on her way to Kiyomi, sees that she is being kidnapped in a moving van. Suddenly, she herself is attacked. Ozaki sees her in the middle of the road and takes her to her house after her insistence while extremely angered. Tatsumi learns now that Natsuno is still alive. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Seishin is meeting Sanako. Later the same night, Ozaki is encountered by Chizuru, who again is wearing a skimpy outfit. He tries to jam a stake in her heart, but Seishiro, standing afar, snipes the stake, breaking it. Chizuru drinks Ozaki's blood and commands him to obey her. Tatsumi goes to Natsuno's home. His father, who has gone clearly insane, tries to kill Tatsumi but to no avail. He and Natsuno then have a chat, where he explains that Natsuno is a rare species of Shiki known as Jinru. He asks Natsuno to join them, and says that he will kill him if he causes any more trouble. Meanwhile, Toru is faced with Ritsuko, who has now risen. She tells Toru that she will refrain from drinking blood as long as she can, in order to not become someone or something she detests. The next day, Ozaki is laying in the clinic, trying to self-treat with a blood transfusion while fighting hallucinations. Later that night, Chizuru goes to meet Ozaki. He asks Chizuru on a date to the Shinto festival, which Chizuru is curious about. She is hesitant at first, but then agrees. Once there, Chizuru sees a ritual and wants to see it up closer, but is scared. After Ozaki pushes her a bit, she agrees. Upon entering, they are surrounded with people. Chizuru gets terrified and orders Ozaki to leave. He refuses and asks Megumi's father to help him to transport her to the shrine office. That is when she understands that Ozaki is not completely under her control. She tries to get away, but is taken deeper into the shrine. Megumi's father also finds Chizuru's scent familiar, stating that the same scent was in Megumi's room before she died. Ozaki pushes him to check her pulse. Upon checking it, he is convinced that she is indeed an undead, and also the one who killed his daughter. Tomio, Atsushi's father, confirms this. As Chizuru screams for help, Seishiro and Atsushi, driving a car, run into the crowd but are stopped by Toshio. Atsushi, scared of his father, runs away. Meanwhile, Chizuru tries to crawl away, but is stopped by the villagers, who start to throw stones at her. She gets wounded. Ozaki demonstrates how to kill these Shiki, but before he is able to, Chizuru wakes up and tries to bite Ozaki, though she is halted by Tomio, who pins her down while Megumi's father kills her with a stake through the heart. Ozaki tells the villagers that he is about to hunt them, and asks for people who are willing to help. Meanwhile, Sanako is informed about Chizuru by Tatsumi. Infuriated, she orders Tatsumi to kill Ozaki, and he promptly heads out to obey her command. Sanako is advised by Seishin to run away. Meanwhile, all the villagers decide to launch a big-scale attack on the Shiki. On the other hand, a Jinru orders all the Shiki to hide or run away because of the situation. As the sun is about to rise, Tatsumi goes to the mansion, entrusts Sanako to Seishin, and tells him to keep Sanako away from danger. Meanwhile, the villagers surround the mansion and get ready to launch their attack. They break into Ibuki Clinic, only to find out it was a hideout. The villagers find the Shiki and begin to kill them, even as they beg for mercy, with the villagers enraged, spare them none. Meanwhile, the residents also break into the mansion, which is already evacuated. Seishin and Sanako hid in the basement, where the former falls into a deep slumber. Shiki are killed one after another. Ozaki gets news that something has happened to his mother at the clinic. Upon arrival, Ozaki finds that she has been murdered. He notices some bloody footprints leading upstairs. He decides to go up and follow them. As it turns out, the one who killed Ozaki's mother was Atsushi, who was sleeping. His father, upon learning this, decides to kill Atsushi himself. Later that evening, although quite a few have been hunted down, Ozaki still thinks that a large number of Shiki are still alive. He figures out they might be hiding in the underground tunnel and proceeds to take the villagers to it. But suddenly, out of nowhere, Seishiro starts to snipe the villagers. He is interrupted by Natsuno. As night approaches, the mansion is still surrounded by the hunters. Tatsumi is able to get into the mansion and goes to see Sanako. He explains their situation and informs her that they are stuck. Meanwhile, Ritsuko is still able to bear her bloodthirst. She begs Toru to let the person she had to attack be freed or at least put into another room, as she couldn't bear it much longer. Toru, having a soft spot for her, allows the victim to leave. Next day, as the sun rises, we get back to the mansion. Sanako is extremely scared as she learns of the situation. In this situation, a rather strange thing happens. As the women go around unloading the dead Shiki from the cars, they don't feel any indifferent. As they go about their activities, they sit down and have a cup of tea, all the while having hands stained in blood. As morning is about to arrive, Miso goes to his old home in order to ask Chizuko for help. She lets him in but is standing inside, ready to kill him. Meanwhile, the Shiki start to launch their counterattack. They feed on the hunters and command them to kill all the other hunters. Soon after, Yoshi, another Jinru, is killed by Chizuru. Meanwhile, Yasi tells ISEKAI about Yameri and how there are a lot of undead there. They run in and kill off any they can find. They also realize that the mansion must have a basement. When they go to the mansion, Tatsumi lures them out, so Seishin and Sonako can escape. As Seishin tries to leave the village, he finds all the routes to be blocked. He sets to go to the temple. On his way, he encounters Ozaki and a few villagers. They follow him back. Seishin decides to hide with Sonako beneath a statue. The villagers think the temple people hid them. Seishin hears a noise outside, so he leaves and tries to look around. He finds his mother, along with the other workers, dead. Sets out to escape again when he is encountered by a hunter. The hunter slices open Seishin's abdomen, but is killed when he hits his head after Seishin tackles him. Seishin makes up with Sonako. As he travels into the mountains, he realizes he left a blood trail, so decides to put Sonako into a crevice and lure the hunters to another place. The hunters keep searching for Seishin even through the night. Sonako wakes up. Seeing Seishin not around and hearing the voices of the hunters, she runs away. Meanwhile, Natsuno had saved Akira and admitted Kori into a hospital. While Megumi is trying to stay hidden from the hunters, she tries to run away from the village but is caught. Upon begging for mercy, she received none and is killed. Natsuno sets fire to the Yameri district, where he sees that Toru and Ritsuko both became undead and were killed. He runs off as Ozaki notices him. Natsuno then confronts Tatsumi, who escaped after luring the villagers away from the mansion. They both fight each other. Natsuno lures Tatsumi into a hole where he lights up dynamite and presumably kills them both. Meanwhile, Sonako is being chased still by Tomio. She runs and runs until she finds the desolate church. She runs and runs until she finds the desolate church. She heads inside, but Tomio finds her. She tries to attack him, but to no avail. He is just about to pierce her little chest, but suddenly Seishin appears. He attacks Tomio and kills him using a farming tool. He is later shown to be a Shiki. Ozaki, on the other hand, is trying to save the Sotoba village from Natsuno's fire. He fails to do so, and the village starts to burn. As fire trucks go to the village from a nearby town, Seishin passes by them in a car, leaving the village along with Sonako. After several days, we see the last of the residents leave Sotoba. And then we see Kori, Akira, and Natsuno's father. The end.